December 19th, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Oberstleutnant Friedrich von der Heydte stands behind a barbed wire enclosure, a prisoner of the American 101st Airborne Division. 3 days earlier, he had commanded a battalion of elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers dropped behind American lines to sow chaos in support of Hitler's desperate Ardennes offensive. Now, hungry and exhausted, he watches something that will haunt him for the remainder of his life. Along the frozen road beyond the prisoner compound, an unbroken column of American trucks rolls eastward toward the front. Not a convoy, not a supply run, an endless mechanical river. Von der Heydte, trained in the arithmetic of warfare, begins to count. 1 truck every 11 seconds. He counts for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. The column does not stop. It does not slow. For 6 consecutive hours, through sleet and gathering darkness, the trucks continue, each one laden with ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts, winter clothing. Von der Heydte's mind performs the calculation instinctively. At this rate, approximately 1,900 trucks in a single day, on a single road, supplying a single sector of a front that stretches from Switzerland to the North Sea. He turns to the American guard and asks a question in careful English. How is this possible? The guard, a farm boy from Iowa, shrugs. Buddy, this ain't nothin'. You should see the main depot. This moment of comprehension, this precise instant when a supremely confident professional soldier realizes that everything he has been taught about warfare is obsolete, is repeated 10,000 times across the European theater between 1942 and 1945. But it is not a moment born in combat. It is not the product of tactical brilliance or technological superiority or the courage of fighting men. It is the product of something far more devastating to the German military psyche, the complete industrialization of logistics on a scale that defies comprehension. In September 1939, when German panzers rolled into Poland, they did so with a logistics doctrine that had changed remarkably little since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The Wehrmacht operated on the principle of Beute and Bewegung, loot and movement. Motorized spearheads would pierce enemy lines, living off captured supplies and fuel, while the bulk of the army followed behind using horse-drawn wagons and requisitioned local transport. This system was not a temporary expedient. It was doctrine. Of 1.5 million horses that served in the Wehrmacht throughout the war, the majority were employed hauling supplies. German officers considered this not a weakness, but a strength, a demonstration of tactical flexibility and operational daring. The idea that an army might carry its entire logistics tail with it, that it might deliberately overburden itself with the weight of supply, seemed to these men not merely inefficient, but philosophically wrong. Warfare, in the German military tradition, was an art form. It demanded speed, maneuver, the decisive stroke. Logistics was something you improvised, adapted, overcame. When these officers first encountered American forces in North Africa in 1943, their initial assessments reflected this worldview. Intelligence reports from Tunisia described the Americans as logistically obese, armies so weighted down with supply vehicles, maintenance depots, and creature comforts that they could barely move. A captured German intelligence summary from March 1943 noted with barely concealed contempt, "The American soldier does not march. He is transported. He does not cook his own rations. They are prepared for him. He does not repair his own equipment. Specialists do this for him. The result is an army of remarkable incompetence in field conditions. Another report, filed by a German captain after observing American positions near Kasserine Pass, concluded their dependence on mechanical transport and prepared supply chains represents a critical vulnerability. Sever their logistics, and they will collapse within days. This assessment was not entirely wrong. The American performance in early North African engagements was often chaotic, the logistics frequently tangled, the coordination between supply and combat units amateurish. But what German observers failed to recognize was that they were witnessing not weakness, but infancy. The American military was learning, and it was learning to execute a form of warfare that would prove utterly incomprehensible to an enemy raised on the poetry of tactical maneuver.
The foundation of this transformation was a single vehicle, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck, known universally as the Deuce and a Half. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 562,750 of these trucks, one rolling off production lines every 2 minutes and 11 seconds, 24 hours a day, for 4 consecutive years. But the number alone fails to capture the psychological impact. Each truck represented 6 tons of cargo capacity, 450 miles of range, all-wheel drive capability that allowed it to traverse terrain that would bog down German horse-drawn wagons. A single American infantry division in 1944 possessed more motor transport than 3 entire German panzer divisions combined. The arithmetic of this disparity began to reveal itself in the summer of 1944, when Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began the race across France. The Red Ball Express became operational on August 25, 1944. It was not, strictly speaking, a military unit. It was a highway, or rather, a dedicated one-way loop of highways running from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front, closed to all civilian traffic, marked with red balls every mile, and devoted entirely to the movement of supplies. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,500 tons of supplies per day. To comprehend this figure, consider that the entire German 6th Army at Stalingrad consumed approximately 750 tons of supplies per day. The Red Ball Express, a single American supply route, delivered 16 Stalingrads worth of material every 24 hours. 6,000 trucks ran the route continuously, drivers working shifts that would be illegal in peacetime, sleeping in their cabs during the 10-minute refueling stops, sustained by amphetamines and coffee, and the certain knowledge that men were dying at the front for want of ammunition. General Der Panzertruppen's Hasso von Montefeld, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, would later describe his first encounter with the full weight of American logistics in terms that reveal the psychological shock. He recalled in a 1952 interview, "We had broken through the American lines. We had advanced 50 kilometers in 3 days. By all the rules of warfare as we understood them, we had achieved operational success. The Americans should have been in retreat, disorganized, scrambling to establish a new defensive line. Instead, we found them resupplied, reinforced, and waiting for us with fresh ammunition. It was as if we were fighting not an army, but a factory that produced soldiers and supplies at the point of contact. You could destroy an American unit in the morning and find it reconstituted by evening with full ammunition loads and hot food. This was not warfare as we knew it. This was something else entirely. What von Montefeld had encountered was the mature American logistics system in full operation, a system that by late 1944 had achieved a level of sophistication that transformed the nature of combat itself. The mathematics of this system are staggering. In December 1944, the U.S. Army in Europe consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day, not per week, per day. This fuel was delivered through a network of pipelines, the Pluto system, and its continental equivalents that stretched from English Channel ports to forward supply dumps 30 miles behind the front lines. The pipelines themselves represented an engineering achievement that dwarfed anything in German capability. 1,500 miles of 6-inch pipe laid at a rate of 30 miles per day, capable of pumping 1 million gallons every 24 hours. German panzer divisions, by contrast, were perpetually fuel-starved, their advances dictated not by enemy resistance, but by the location of the nearest fuel depot. The disparity extended to every category of supply. Artillery ammunition provides perhaps the most dramatic example. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery fired 2.5 million shells in the first week of combat. This represented more artillery ammunition that Germany produced in the entire year of 1944. The shells arrived at the front with such regularity that American artillery doctrine evolved to treat ammunition as effectively infinite. Forward observers could call for fire on targets of opportunity, a suspected machine gun nest, a crossroads that might be used by enemy transport, a tree line that could conceal enemy positions without consideration of ammunition conservation. German artillery officers, trained to husband their limited shell supplies for critical moments, found themselves facing an enemy who could saturate entire map squares with high explosive, simply because a recon patrol reported vague movement. But the true psychological weapon was not the abundance itself, it was the reliability. American supply officers developed systems of predictive logistics that bordered on the prophetic. Every division maintained consumption rate charts based on combat intensity, weather conditions, terrain type, and operational tempo. Supply officers could predict with eerie accuracy how many rounds of .30 caliber ammunition would be expended per rifle per day in heavy bocage fighting versus open terrain pursuit operations. These predictions allowed supply convoys to be dispatched before requests were even filed, arriving at forward units with precisely the materials needed, often before company commanders realized they needed them.
The human element of this system is easy to overlook amid the statistics, but it was here that the German psychological collapse became most evident. German soldiers, raised in a military culture that celebrated the combat soldier and viewed support personnel as secondary, found themselves captured and processed by an American military where the rear echelon was not merely present, but dominant. A German infantry sergeant, captured near Aachen in October 1944, recorded his impressions in a diary later seized by American intelligence. "We marched for 3 days to reach a prisoner transit camp. Along the route, we saw perhaps 200 American soldiers in combat uniforms. We saw thousands in support roles: truck drivers, mechanics, cooks, clerks, medical personnel, military police, engineers, signal corps. For every American soldier who carries a rifle, there seem to be 10 who carry wrenches and clipboards. At first, we mocked this. We called them soft. But then I understood, this is why they win. They have built an army that does not depend on the individual soldier's ability to endure hardship. They have built an army that brings the factory to the battlefield." This observation cuts to the core of the psychological transformation. The German military tradition valorized hardship, the soldier's ability to march through pain, to fight on empty stomachs, to improvise weapons from battlefield scrap. This was not merely practical, but spiritual. Suffering forged superior warriors. The Americans seem to have rejected this entire philosophy. They insisted on hot food at the front lines, on regular mail delivery, on medical care for even minor injuries, on systematic equipment maintenance, on adequate rest for combat units.
To German observers, this appeared soft, even decadent. But the results spoke with brutal clarity. American infantry divisions could sustain combat operations indefinitely. German divisions, worn down by chronic supply shortages, disease, and exhaustion, collapsed after weeks of continuous engagement. The scale of American medical logistics alone represented a form of psychological warfare. The U.S. Army Medical Corps in Europe maintained a bed capacity of 150,000, more hospital beds than many entire nations possessed. Casualties were evacuated from front lines to field hospitals in matters of hours, treated by specialists, supplied with antibiotics and plasma in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. The survival rate for wounded American soldiers who reached medical care exceeded 95%. German wounded, by contrast, often died of treatable injuries due to lack of basic medical supplies. Morphine, sulfa drugs, plasma, these were rarities in German field hospitals, used sparingly and only for the most critical cases. American medics carried more morphine in their personal aid bags than some German field hospitals possessed in total. By the winter of 1944-1945, this disparity had created a perverse incentive structure among German troops. Surrender to American forces became for many German soldiers not an act of cowardice, but of rational calculation. And captured Obergefreiter from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, interviewed in January 1945, stated the logic with remarkable candor. "I have been fighting for 4 months on quarter rations. I have not received mail from home in 6 weeks. I have not changed my clothes in 3 weeks. My squad mates have dysentery, we have no medicine. 2 days ago, our ammunition resupply failed to arrive. We are told to hold our positions with 8 rounds per rifle. Yesterday, I watched American soldiers eating hot food from insulated containers 50 meters from the front line. I watched them receive mail. I made my decision. I waited until dark and walked toward the American lines with my hands raised. I am now in a camp where I receive 3 meals per day, medical care, and the certainty that I will survive this war. This is not surrender. This is escape." The Battle of the Bulge represents the moment when German military leadership was forced to confront the full implications of this logistical disparity. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive was, from a tactical perspective, audacious and well-conceived. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, broke through American lines, and advanced rapidly toward their objectives. For approximately 72 hours, the offensive succeeded on its own terms. Then, the American logistics system responded, and the nature of the battle changed entirely. Within 48 hours of the initial German breakthrough, the U.S. Army had redirected 11 divisions to the Ardennes sector. These were not skeleton formations scraped together from reserves. They were full-strength divisions with complete equipment sets, 3 days of combat supplies, and organic transport. The movement involved over 250,000 men and 50,000 vehicles, executed in winter conditions over congested roads, completed in less than a week. German operational planning, rooted in First World War experience, assumed that this sort of strategic redeployment would require 3 to 4 weeks minimum. The Americans executed it in a sixth of the expected time.
But the more devastating response was logistical. By December 22nd, 6 days into the battle, American forces in the Ardennes were receiving 5,000 tons of supplies per day, despite weather conditions that had grounded air transport and made road movement treacherous. The supplies arrived by truck convoy, drivers navigating icy roads in blackout conditions, maintaining a flow of material that exceeded the total daily supply allocation for all German forces on the Western Front. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose ex-LVI Panzer Corps spearheaded the German advance, later described the psychological moment when he understood the offensive had failed. It was not a single event. It was the accumulation of observations. Our reconnaissance reported American artillery firing harassing missions throughout the night. Firing, we understood, simply because they had ammunition to waste. We captured supply dumps that we assumed would provision our advance for a week. The Americans abandoned them without apparent concern, as if they were trivial. Most telling, we monitored American radio traffic. They were not panicked. They were not even particularly concerned. They were coordinating supply deliveries with the same tone you might use to arrange a dinner party. This is when I knew we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an economic system. The German fuel situation during the Bulge exemplifies this asymmetry with painful clarity. The entire German offensive was predicated on capturing American fuel dumps. The operation was literally planned around the assumption that German panzers would run out of fuel and would need to refuel from captured American stocks to continue. When questioned after the war about the strategic dependency, General Oberst Alfred Jodl responded with remarkable frankness. "We had no choice. We lacked the fuel reserves to sustain the offensive from our own resources. We knew this. We planned the operation anyway because the alternative was to wait passively for defeat. It was a gamble born of desperation. The gamble failed not because American forces fought with particular brilliance, but because the American logistical system proved impossible to disrupt. German spearheads reached American supply dumps only to find them methodically destroyed or evacuated. The fuel they desperately needed was simply driven away by truck convoy, relocated to new dumps 20 miles distant, as if petroleum were as disposable as dirt. By January 1945, when the German offensive had been completely reversed, American forces had expended more supplies in the Ardennes than they had in the entire North African campaign. They had replaced combat losses of vehicles and equipment at a rate that exceeded German production capacity by a factor of 12. They had fed and sustained 600,000 men in combat conditions without interruption, and they had done so while simultaneously maintaining offensive operations in Italy, preparing for the Rhine crossing, and sustaining a strategic bombing campaign that required its own vast logistical infrastructure. The Americans had fought a battle of attrition and made attrition itself into an art form. Not the attrition of men, but the attrition of enemy belief systems. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 demonstrated the full maturity of the American logistical system. The operation required the pre-positioning of 60,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, bridge-building materials, fuel, rations, medical supplies. This material was assembled, sorted, and positioned at exact locations along an 80-mile front in a period of 3 weeks. The operation itself consumed 2,000 tons of ammunition per hour during the initial assault phase. German defenders watching this preparation through the distortion of desperation could barely comprehend the scale. A German lieutenant, captured during the crossing, told his interrogators, "We knew you were coming. We had excellent intelligence. We knew your timing, your assault points, your objectives. None of it mattered. We could not counter what we understood to be inevitable. How do you defend against an enemy who can afford to fire 2,000 tons of artillery shells simply to suppress a defensive position? You cannot. You can only hope that your death will be quick." The advance into Germany proper revealed perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of American logistics. The actual system actually improved as the campaign progressed. Distance from supply bases decreased. The German rail network, despite bombing damage, was rapidly restored to service carrying American supplies. By April 1945, American forces were receiving more supplies in central Germany than they had received in France the previous autumn. The logistics had not strained, they had scaled. German defenders found themselves facing an enemy whose strength increased with every mile of advance, who seemed to draw power from the very ground they conquered. The production statistics that enabled this system defy comprehension even in retrospect. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced 2.4 million military trucks, more trucks than the rest of the world combined. It produced 324,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 17.4 million rifles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 2.6 million tons of artillery shells. But these numbers, while staggering, fail to capture the crucial element. These items were produced with systematic standardization that allowed for universal interchangeability. A spark plug manufactured in Detroit would fit a truck manufactured in Cleveland. An artillery shell produced in Alabama would chamber perfectly in a howitzer produced in Pennsylvania.
This admission from a man who had overseen German military operations for years, who had access to every intelligence report and operational analysis, represents the complete psychological capitulation that American logistics had achieved. The German military, heir to Clausewitz and Moltke, raised on the poetry of decisive battle and the romance of tactical genius, had been forced to confront a brutal reality that in industrialized total war, logistics is strategy. The nation that can produce more, transport more, and waste more will win, regardless of tactical sophistication. The Americans had not merely defeated Germany, they had rendered the entire German military philosophy obsolete. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond World War II. The American military's approach to logistics, the emphasis on overwhelming supply superiority, on statistical prediction of consumption, on standardization and interchangeability, on treating soldiers as valuable assets worth enormous investment to preserve, became the template for modern military operations. Every American military engagement since 1945 has been characterized by the same logistical approach: establish absolute supply superiority, sustain forces indefinitely, accept higher logistical overhead in exchange for operational flexibility. The approach has been criticized as wasteful, as excessive, as representing triumph of quantity over quality. But the criticism misses the point. The American logistical system in World War II was not a means to victory. It was victory itself. Victory achieved before the first shot was fired. Victory written into production schedules and shipping manifests. Victory that arrived by truck convoy rather than bayonet charge. The German military leadership understood this eventually, but understanding came too late, arrived after the illusions had been shattered, after the myths of tactical superiority had been ground into the mud of France and buried beneath the rubble of Germany. Von der Heydt, the paratrooper who had counted trucks in Bastogne, would later write in his memoir, "I realized that day that we had lost not just a battle, but a fundamental argument about the nature of modern war. We believed that war was art, that it demanded inspiration and genius and the cultivation of a warrior spirit. The Americans proved that war is industry, that it demands production and logistics and the systematic application of resources. Artists cannot defeat factories. That is the lesson of the war. That is the lesson we learned too late." The arithmetic of annihilation was simple in the end. 1 truck every 2 minutes, 12,000 tons per day, 562,000 vehicles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. These were not merely numbers. They were weapons. Weapons that shattered armies and ideologies with equal efficiency. Weapons that proved more devastating than any bomb or bullet. Weapons that transformed warfare itself into a contest not of courage or skill, but of productive capacity. The Wehrmacht was not defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated in the factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the accounting departments that calculated consumption rates, and the logistics depots that turned predictions into reality. It was defeated by clerks and truck drivers, by production schedules and shipping manifests, by the quiet competence of an economic system that could produce 2.4 million trucks and consider it merely adequate. The German soldier who asked, "How is this possible?" never received a satisfactory answer, but he lived long enough to understand that he had asked the wrong question. The question was never how it was possible. The question was how Germany ever imagined it could win against an enemy for whom the impossible was merely standard procedure.